So this milestone weekend is an occasion for our graduates both to celebrate their time here and to reflect on the lives that lie ahead. We have the pleasure of hearing now from someone who is one of the country's most sparkling writers of nonfiction and whose close studies of the lives of others have resulted in a string of award-winning biographies. Please welcome Stacy Schiff, class of 1982.
Thank you, President Falk. Let me set your minds immediately at ease about a few things. First of all, I am famously brief. No more than 22 minutes separate you from the next anthem. That is one episode of Parks and Recreation without the commercials. Second of all, none of what I'm about to say will be on the exam, for the simple and sublime reason, class of 2013, that you have no more exams. More to the point, I have no earthly expectation that you'll remember a word of what I'm about to say. How do I know that? Because when President Falk called to tell me of the great honor of addressing you astonishing almost alumni, on the indelible evening of your Williams graduation, I quite naturally cast back to the indelible evening of my Williams graduation to discover that I retain not a single memory of the 1982 Baccalaureate Address, or even who might have delivered it. I can, however, offer a full catalog of memories of the steps of this building. If you've spent any time on Chapin Beach in the sun with an iced coffee in your hand, you know what I majored in at Williams. Emily Calkins has nothing on me. Was it that controversial? Another thing I can't remember is any Williams assignment remotely as challenging as this one. As Reverend Spalding put it in his eloquent marching orders, we convene today to share some reflective moments of connection, rediscovery, gratitude, and awe. It is the baccalaureate speaker's job to send you, the astounding, high-achieving class of 2013, off on the journey ahead, uplifted, contemplative, virtuous, and whole, aware of your many gifts, eager to share them with the world, appreciative and inspired, sustained yet hungry, spiritually as well as intellectually. Suddenly, writing a 300-page biography of Cleopatra without a shred of source material is looking easier and easier. Reverend Spalding did not mention that it is my job to offer you any wisdom. You are already brimming with wisdom. You have every reason to feel wiser than you will feel for a very long time. But let's be honest. There's a convention to these talks. They have a transactional nature. I am here as an emissary from your future. I am meant to hand on the baton, to transmit a few trenchant ideas and motivating ideals, to slip some stimulants into your already well-caffeinated minds. You have more language than you do experience. I envy you that. Among other things, I too would like to send my credit card bills to your parents. I envy you too because I know things for which I suddenly seem to have insufficient vocabulary. So, as I see it, our exchange goes something like this. I am here to wave you into the future, to offer some rousing, radiant words of inspiration, and you are here to make me feel old. The 1982 baccalaureate speaker was the cartoonist Gary Trudeau. I know this because while my memory may be flawed, there are no lacuna in the college archives. Having come to that address 33 years late, I can tell you too that Gary Trudeau spoke beautifully, if about things that make no sense today, like an $8,000 tuition bill. He wrote his speech on a typewriter, cutting and pasting the old-fashioned way and editing in blue ink and red pencil. I mention this not because I am doing promotion for Office Depot, but because when his pages landed on my desk, my eye went immediately to the traces of what Trudeau had deleted, which I realize is how I have come to read. As an historian, as a biographer, I instinctively grasp at what is missing, the book that isn't on the library shelf, but that I might somehow conjure into existence, the omission in a life story that unlocks it, the awkward, revelatory silence, the record that someone has gone to some measures to distort or destroy. In other words, I want to speak to you this afternoon about the fugitive, the missing and the marginal, about the things that disappear as your Williams years begin to evaporate behind you. The human hunger for permanence, the impulse to impress one's existence on the world, appears to be as old as time itself. Already in Cleopatra's youth, we're talking a generation or two before the birth of Christ, the pyramids, all the monuments of Egypt, were sported graffiti. Most of them amounted to some version of, "I saw and I was amazed." But there was the occasional original. On one Luxor tomb, someone had scrawled, "Does your mother know you're here?" Some visitors defaced monuments in faux hieroglyphics. Hedging his bets, one overachiever left his name in both Latin and Greek. This was what passed in the ancient world for social media. Graffiti, however, is not forever. Like the historical record, the surface of monuments can be scrubbed clean, which brings me to an artifact of which I'd like to sing the praises. On my desk are several rubbery pink rectangles. Think of them as disillusionment charms. Those charms can make words disappear by allowing them to take on the color and the texture of the paper on which they're written. Indeed, those erasers have a vintage feel, but since I write in pencil, on paper, they qualify as a kind of power tool. They obliterate the lame or the lazy sentence, the half-baked and the blighted. A piece of prose isn't really anything until the 79th draft, and even then it isn't always something. And by that time, both eraser and author are generally exhausted. This is probably the time to mention that what most writers thrill to is the making of sentences, coaxing words to deliver some semblance of one's intended meaning without straining under the load, and whenever possible, whistling on the job. In other words, what I do all day happens also to be invisible. It requires a great deal of staring out the window. In fact, my experience proves that if you stare out the window long enough, more or less steadily over the course of 4 or 5 years, for example, you wind up with a book. This is why movies about working writers are seldom very good, or for that matter, very different really from movies about blocked writers. The literary action figure leaps headlong into a burning building and emerges with what? A semicolon over his arm. Yeats noted that the poet is not the accident, the bundle of accident and incoherence that sits down to breakfast. It's the biographer's job to make him so, to reduce him to the sum of his not yet determined parts. I am to restore the forks in the road, make the story fragile again, inject the notes of indecision, the might-have-beens, the if-onlys, the near misses, the doubts and the detours. You may well know that when Abraham Lincoln heads to Booth's Theater on an April night in 1865, he will not return to the White House. You surely know that when Billie Jean King faces Bobby Riggs across a net in the Houston Astrodome, she will demolish him. But you want to read on, as if this time he or she might not, as if you're heading toward an ending that is altogether in question, sort of the way you feel right now about your lives, if perhaps without the attendant anxiety. The historian subsists on the tactical omission, the unconnected dots, the written over and the overlooked. In 47 BC, Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt, found her kingdom threatened by Rome, then the rising power in the Mediterranean. She had a child that year with Julius Caesar, the most powerful Roman general. That was not a coincidence. For murkier reasons, she sailed a few years later to Rome to stay in Caesar's villa, while he lived in the center of town with his wife, who, as it happened, had not borne him a son. The historians of that era were nearly all of them officers of what would become the Roman Empire. It was not in their interest to note Caesar's dalliance with a foreign queen, least of all, one toting around a half-Roman child. As a result, we are practically without record of Cleopatra's visit. It would be lost to us were it not for the fact that she let someone down while in Rome. That happened to be Cicero, a man who lived for a good grievance. It irked him that the Egyptian queen had a better library than he did. Hers happened to be the legendary Library of Alexandria. Worse, Cleopatra had meant to send Cicero a book, which she never delivered. The moral of this particular story is to keep your promises. You might also bear in mind that privilege carries with it certain obligations. Also, you should never offend a writer. At one point in February or March of my sophomore year, I skipped my morning classes to read Nabokov's Speak Memory. I then skipped the next day's classes so as to reread the book. Those of you who lived in Bryan House, this was on the 3rd floor. Clearly, I should have gone to class because 14 years later, having reread that most sumptuous of memoirs, along with Lolita and Pnin and a few other titles, I found myself wondering about the person on their dedication pages. Nabokov dedicated nearly every book to his wife, a form of single-mindedness that smacks either of apology or pathology. I knew nothing about Mrs. Nabokov because she had insisted that her husband's biographers leave her out of their accounts. As one of them later put it, there's a hole at the center of Nabokov's story, and there always will be. I read that as an open invitation. Rarely had a couple been so entwined. Vera Nabokov read all of her husband's pages. She wrote the bulk of his correspondence. She suggested certain books, vetoed others, submitted notes for one, saved another one from the flames. That one happened to be Lolita. She then went to absurd lengths to absent herself from the record. This meant that she did things like edit biographies of her husband in page proofs and then, and I'm not making this up, erase every one of her comments from the margins. I was, in essence, writing a biography of the Cheshire Cat. Mrs. Nabokov trafficked in all kinds of misstatements, and proving them so took me years. My favorite was the answer to the question of what she was doing day after day in her husband's classroom. Beginning in 1948, Nabokov taught at Cornell for nearly a decade, and during that time his wife attended every lecture. Those on European literature were the most popular on campus, partly because Nabokov did not teach literature as it has been taught before or since. For one thing, he renamed the books. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground was, in Nabokov's classroom, Memoirs from a Mouse Hole. He talked about Don Quixote in terms of how he would have rewritten the book. Part of the charm came in the insults. Before thousands of undergraduates, he shredded those miserable mediocrities: Dostoevsky, Stendhal, Balzac, Faulkner, Camus, Conrad, and Austen. This was a man who later confided there were precisely 2 reasons to consider an academic career. 1, the libraries. 2, the vacations. What was Mrs. Nabokov doing in her husband's classroom day after day? You don't, after all, see Mrs. Dew accompanying Professor Dew to class. We all prefer a narrative, and the Cornell students did their best. The explanations that they came up with ran the gamut. Nabokov was blind, and she was the seeing eye dog. The professor had no idea what was going to come out of his mouth, and no memory of what did, so she had to write it all down so he would know what to put on the exams. She was a ventriloquist. She had a gun in her purse, and she was there to defend him. That one was actually partly true. An earlier biographer had solved the riddle by writing that Mrs. Nabokov was there because her husband, quote, likes to be able to watch faces as he reads, unquote. I read that line several times before realizing that it made no sense whatsoever. What he had said, but what Mrs. Nabokov had erased, was that her husband liked to be able to watch his wife's face as he read, but she had rewritten the line in page proofs. For the last few years, I've been researching a book on the Salem witch hunt, of which we know everything and nothing. We're fascinated by nervous breakdowns, of which Salem was more or less a collective one. Those 10 months of 1692 happened also to be a period that nearly everyone involved preferred to forget, even well after the fact. "The people of Salem do not like to be questioned in regard to the witchery affair," noted the Philadelphia Inquirer 200 years later. 57 years after that, in Salem to research the crucible, Arthur Miller complained that he could not get anyone to talk about it with him. 17th century Salem was a famously contentious village. The Puritans were champion record keepers. So they cataloged their quarrels with each other, the controversies that divided them and that would flare up during the trials, and they then rewrote the record books, leaving out the damning sections. The Salem minister in whose house the witchcraft broke out kept a record of the village deaths. He did not include the 5 villagers who were hung, the 2 who died in prison, or the old man pressed to death, all of them accused witches. Presumably for the same reason, the records of the actual trials long ago went missing. There are plenty of historical events that never happened until a generation or 2 after they actually did. This is especially true of traumas, which pose the question, to expiate or to erase. Until recently, France imposed a sort of national forgetting on its treatment of Jews under the occupation. You will remember that in Orwell's 1984, the Ministry of Truth revised records to bring them in line with dogma. They were not alone in that practice. In the run-up to World War I, Russia and France both falsified official documents. It's an old bromide that the first casualty of war is truth, but there are plenty of corollaries. In the French translation of my biography of Saint-Exupéry, much of the fall of France has been eliminated. In that edition, France is just barely defeated in 1940. Thomas Hardy wrote his own biography to be published under his wife's name after his death. Mrs. Hardy dutifully did so, but first she cut out all the admiring references to the first wife. Perspective and politics, embarrassment and ego are not the only reasons the historical record winds up askew. There is less of the Marquis de Lafayette in my book about Ben Franklin and the American Revolution than probably there should be. This is for a very simple reason. I could not read Lafayette's handwriting. I defy any of you to do so. I mentioned this frustration to the great historian Peter Gay after months and months in the French archives, where the illegible comes in all varieties. Replied Peter, "But Stacy, clearly you don't know Gay's law of history." "What is that?" I asked. "If you can't read it," Peter said, "it never happened." And then there's the inner life, the biographer's holy grail. Ben Franklin left us miles of documentation, barrels of statements, quotations for every occasion. He also left next to nothing of himself. He's absent even from his own autobiography. He's been called the only person in American history without an unconscious. It pays, though, to remember that his autobiography, that national primer on industry and diligence, is a book Franklin never managed to finish. And if Franklin has gone down in history as a benevolent man, it's in part because he slipped the angry letters, unmailed, into his top desk drawer. These are the shards the biographer fixes on, the photos that didn't make it into the album. You know this from story time. The raw and the non-curated comes closer to the truth than does the posting and the posturing. So yes, you figured it out. What the biographer wants is not that familiar portrait on the $100 bill. The biographer wants Ben Franklin's selfies. You have not needed to deface a pyramid because you have been able to curate and publish your lives. They've been posted, forwarded, tweeted, retweeted, pinned, shared, snapped, favorited, and Instagrammed. Your generation has redefined permanence and privacy. You know what I'm talking about. How many times have your parents urged you to take down those solo cup pictures? Things just don't disappear the way they used to. Indeed, you have a delete button on your computer. It is designed to eradicate things, but in a paradox of technology, have you noticed that my pink eraser does a better job? Think about it. Your computer can swallow an entire term paper. Sawyer Library can be raised, but your tweets are eternal. When Gary Trudeau spoke to our class We were still reeling in the wake of Watergate from the disillusionment generated by 18 and a half minutes of missing White House tape. We had cover-ups where you have leaks, wayward tweets, surveillance tapes, wardrobe malfunctions, drones, classified military intel. People often ask me what the future holds for biography when letters no longer exist. But the reverse strikes me as a greater danger. If nothing truly disappears anymore, the contours of a life may prove impossible to discern. This is the old burying the truth in a blizzard of information trick. The internet may not know how to let go, but you do. Memory is designed to be imperfect. Otherwise, it fixes us in a sort of totalitarian headlock. Debussy once described music as the space between the notes. Miles Davis went him one better. "It's not the notes you play," said Davis, "it's the notes you don't play that make the difference." Those are the things we jettison, the invisible objects we trip over and that turn out to be the problems and solutions that no one else had noticed. What we choose to erase is as essential as what we choose to preserve. The absences resonate and loom large. Remember that 6-word short story, falsely attributed to Hemingway? Baby shoes, never used, for sale. No matter how you fill them, the spaces make you cry. Think about those things legendary simply for being lost. Atlantis, Jamestown, an entire tribe of Israel, the Library of Alexandria, good manners, the working bar once known as the Williams Log. 3 final thoughts which I wish someone had shared with me. The humorous is not the enemy of the intelligent. You don't have to read Philip Roth or Austen or Flaubert to discover as much. If you don't happen to have a sense of humor, well, get one. You're going to need it. Life is a joke. And if you don't believe me, just think about what you're wearing on your heads tomorrow morning. Secondly, look around you for a second, and I mean it, do it. If I had done that, I don't mean to frighten you, but if I had done that 33 years ago, I would have seen my closest friend, Marc de la Bruyere, whom I met on the first day of freshman year, and whose fault it is that I stand before you today, as he bullied me into writing my first book. 8 or so years after leaving Williams, I also fell in love with him, married him, and had 3 children with him, all of whom are sitting in this chapel today. This feels wildly improbable to me, but stranger things could happen to you. You're going to support, annoy, inspire, desire, and yes, even marry each other. Don't take the Williams connection for granted. You don't want to make today the last time you play on a team where everyone else is smarter than you. Lastly, that dream about the exam that you forgot to study for, forgot to show up for, couldn't locate, the dream about the exam administered in a language you don't speak or that you went to naked. I'm very sorry to break this to you, but you're going to have that dream for the rest of your life. I'm fairly certain that cavemen had that dream. It's the default stress scenario. Long after he had left Cornell, Nabokov had regular nightmares that he was about to deliver a lecture but could not decipher his own notes. You can see what he did with that when you read Penin. Williams class of 2013, thanks to this incomparable institution, you have just had the best education out there. Venture off-road with it. As a great translator put it, any fool can find his way. A poet alone can lose it. It is your God-given right to resist autocorrect. Keep an eye out for what's missing. Congratulations.